Good day to you, and one last day for CMST 410 Comparative Media, an online video class. And it's fitting that we ask, where have we gone and what have we learned? So here's a brief summary as you look behind me, I hope, and recognize the very place where many of you have gone for many years physically, East Stroudsburg University. Can you see the smokestack? Yeah, that's where a lot of you have your degree coming from. So in this class, which has contributed to that degree, hopefully, we've taken a look at media systems from around the world. We've taken a look at a whole bunch of different elements that make up a system, and then we looked at how the systems are different by different countries. And you remember the elements, each one was a chapter. We had financing, we had regulation, we had philosophies, we had cultural characteristics, and others, which I hope that you will remember, not necessarily all of them, but many of them when you look at media in the future. And we also found that there were some very unique attributes between some of the countries that make them special, in part because of their culture, in part because of the conflicts that they've had with other countries, in part because of their newness. There's a lot of reasons that go into making a country, you know? And media is just one part of that country. So having said that, though, we can say some things about each individual country, starting with France. France is really unique. It's got this thing about beauty and culture, and the government is heavily involved in that, making sure that media are producing culture, and also making sure that commercial broadcasters, at least, have a competitor to be judged against, and that's the French government. So it's both a regulator and it's also a competitor. Very strange model, and we see that in its public broadcasting systems where it has commercials inside of non-commercial programming. So that's one very special thing about France. But also, before we leave France too quickly, this beauty element comes into play very much. The French really like to make things beauty, and it may not be your particular taste in what is beauty, but the point is they will not just let something stand unless it has a beautiful element to it. And that beauty includes the human body. So that kind of introduces one of the areas that I'm going to talk about at the end of the class, and that has to do with what is okay to be shown on the part of the body to a television audience. And France is one of those countries that shows genitalia from both sexes, both genders, not quite sure how to say it, but men, women. You see penises, buttocks, vaginas, and breasts, to put it just in medical terms, or very bluntly anyhow, anatomy-wise. So that's France. It's got a lot of dimensions that are very unique to it. Now moving on to Sweden. Sweden, we have another country that's somewhat similar to France, certainly in terms of nudity. You can even say the Swedes are more in their general lives accepting of nudity, and that also shows its way onto television. But there's also a little bit something different about the Swedes in that they are more clinical and more, how should we say, direct in the way that they discuss things, including the human body. And we gave lots of examples of that throughout the course, but the point is that the Swedes, they're just going to say it to you how they think. And if it hurts your feelings or not, if it makes you feel great, that's very great. They're very happy with that. But if they're telling you something that disappoints you, their expectations, you're going to say, I see, and then move on to another subject. In terms of media, we have a couple things going on that are of special note, and that is Sweden has a government that's very involved in funding the opposing opinion of another potential government or competitor, if you want to look at it that way, by virtue of funding the alternate newspaper in major markets. And that's a very strange thing for a government to be funding your possible opposition. And that just shows how committed Sweden is to the ideals of democracy, where there should be multiple voices, even if it means you have to guarantee some who don't have the economic advantage the ability to have a voice. We also know in Sweden that they have lots of channels dedicated to public programming on radio. They have those P channels, if you remember, P through 7, P through 8, I think it even goes, one of them being in Finnish. So that is quite interesting for such a small country to have 5 different national public radio channels that you can hear wherever you are in Sweden if you have terrestrial radio. Moving to the UK is kind of second to the US in terms of its output of media around the world. I mean, The UK pumps out a lot of media, and the BBC is a very well funded, although it has been cut like lots of other public organizations, a very well funded organization, and it does a lot of things absolutely first rate. I mean, I saw a documentary that the BBC did following Alexander as he might have walked around the Mediterranean to conquer the known world. I'm talking about Alexander the Great. Hopefully you've had him in one of your history classes. He conquered the known world, which is all the countries north of the Mediterranean. The BBC actually went on location and had a person walk from Britain all the way to Mesopotamia, all the way across into the Middle East. They recreated this, and that takes a lot of money and a lot of dedication of time, equipment, resources, and just really dedication to quality. So that's something that's very special about the British, is they really want to put together quality media. And that holds true for really all their media, even their tabloids. They don't want to be known as just out-and-out gossip rags, if I can say it that way. They want their tabloids to be known as legitimate newspaper publications that can actually break stories. And that is very, very unique to British media as well. And finally, about British media, with the people reading so often as they do in Britain, there just is, I don't know how to say this without sounding condescending, but it just seems like they're able to have conversations at a little bit different level. One might even say a higher level, in the average person talking about the average thing, sitting in a bar, analyzing life. The level of conversation is, you got to pay attention sometimes in England, otherwise you're going to get lost. If nothing else, in the wit comes at you so quick. As we saw in that show, Never Mind the Buzzcocks, there was quick wit. Okay, moving now to the United States. We know that the United States is a country that has a lot of commercials. We talked about that consistently in this country. We also know that the United States is a big exporter. We send a lot of media around the world, and we should really, though we didn't mention it much, should say film is a big part of that, because Hollywood and Hollywood films are all over the world, although they are second to another country's film industry, which some of you may not have known, and that is India. India and Bollywood, if you've heard of that, actually puts out more films than Hollywood. At any rate, the U.S. has a lot of exports, radio singers, song singers, I should say, going on radio stations around the world. Our newspapers, New York Times, USA Today, you can find in most parts of the world. Our television programs are all over most countries' television channels. It's a way for some of them, the poorer countries anyhow, to fill their programming time slots by buying second-run and third-run U.S. TV programs. We also know that in general, we have a philosophy towards freedom and freedom from government. And that is something to think about. It is the United States that, in a way, sort of, I don't want to say invented, but certainly tried to put into practice for one of the first times that kind of decision-making process with government, where you have representation by the people who pay the taxes. Okay, this is a little bit out of the blue, but I just want to make sure that I mention something that's very positive about the United States that has certainly contributed a concept that we later saw play out in philosophies like the social media philosophy, actually adopted more by European countries. When I rolled that out, I mentioned that. But it's an American ideal, the ideal of newspapers, radio stations, TV stations. Just control yourself. The government won't get involved. You start to do dumb things, and the government won't get involved. Unfortunately, that does include some things that some people consider to be a bit silly, like profanity. More about that later. Coming to Mexico, now we can say that Mexico is a country that's very, very different in terms of being a developing country. Most developing countries, they have a hard time feeding themselves. That's one thing that makes them a developing country. Mexico has no problem with feeding itself. You can live in Mexico without any money if you're just willing to scour the streets and pick fruit and eat that and dive in the ocean. I mean, if you can live that way in Mexico, and plenty of people do. But Mexico also has a tremendous amount of wealth. The two reigning TV networks have some of the finest production values in the world. That's why you have the telenovelas, those soap operas from Mexico going all over the world, even in places like Russia. But at the same time, Mexico is still getting away from a past of corruption, still getting away from a past of one political party and authoritarianism and being dominated by other cultures, Spanish cultures, and to some extent the U.S., even though Mexico does not really bear a grudge, so to speak. They have that way of laughing about things like that, but it's just all part of Mexican culture. And in terms of media, it leads to a very interesting variety In television, you have a lot of American programs in the evening, lots of American sports in Mexico in the evening on television. And newspapers mostly local, mostly all Mexican, mostly not really read that much, probably. We don't know. The figures aren't available. The government buys inserts in newspapers. That kind of keeps the whole thing clammed up. But there's a lot of newspapers, and you can read a lot of viewpoints in Mexico. Moving now to China. China's a country that for many reasons is a bit of a question mark, because it's a country that has a closed system, at least in the sense that its political philosophy says we are going to control what information gets in and what information gets out of China, whether that's the internet through the Internet Security Police Force, or whether it's just preventing TV shows from the US and Britain and or Canada or France or whoever knows where from coming into China because they contain too much violence or contain too much sex or contain too much commercialism. That's the way that China can be characterized. At the same time, though, the government is very strongly involved in uplifting the content of the Chinese media, as is Russia, and that is making sure that there's a place for and funding for classical programming, Chinese melody dramas. That's their name of their soap operas, but they tell ancient stories with morals to them. Morals that human beings face every single day. And so the Chinese opera is really an art form that is just so old and is so grandiose that the Chinese government is going to make sure that that is not forgotten in the midst of entertainment taking over. So you have that side to China as well. On the newspapers are very strange to look at for me, because you have the Total Party Communist newspaper, which is all Communist Party. You can say propaganda. They even have a Ministry of Propaganda. The private newspapers, they're more into entertainment. That's okay with the Chinese government. They will cover pop singers. They'll be careful what they cover about them. And they will criticize municipal governments, the little governments like in East Stroudsburg or Stroudsburg, to try and help root out corruption. So it's a new kind of thing, China. There's lots of advertising as well. I want to make sure I mention that as well. So China is experimenting with a new political philosophy. You could say it's sort of in between socialism and communism, but it has a strong engine of growth from capitalism. That's the way that I would say it. Moving now to Ghana. Ghana is a country that is still growing up as a new country. It's still trying to just get basic infrastructure built, highways, sewer systems, schools for education, and routes and conduits for media, to get electronic media especially to places that don't have electricity still, or places that are so remote you're just not economically feasible to run a cable system out there. And then with newspapers, we've already noted several times that you're kind of limited if you have languages where people are only speaking in oral communication. We'll see if those languages actually start to go away in the next 100 years, in part because it's so necessary to be able to read on the internet, to read words. So, but we do have English as a first language in Ghana. And we have a lot of programs that are surfacing on the TV side of things to try and celebrate Ghanaian culture and make sure it doesn't get forgotten forever. We might also mention about Ghana, it's in a unique circumstance because it's surrounded by 3 French-speaking nations. So when it comes to imports, it can't really just grab something from across the border. It has to actually look to places like Nigeria or the United States or the Caribbean for musical influences to get imports. And so even that is difficult for Ghana. All of this, I think, will change, though, because of this huge oil deposit they've discovered in Ghana, which when tapped will eventually start to, if it doesn't go into the hands of just a very few select people, will do Ghana some good. Certainly will change it. And then that leaves us finally with Lebanon. Lebanon is a country that really is so small and so fragmented and has such a history of being stepped on, and still continues in this kind of position. I don't know whether it's the nature of where it's placed in the world, on a body of water like that you have to go through to get to a bunch of other countries that already have turmoil in them. Iran, Iraq, Syria, for example. I don't know if it's that. I don't know if it's something else, but Lebanon, it always seems to be struggling with internal conflicts, with funding, with fears of wars with outside nations, with out and out poverty. But yet it's a country of great potential. As I think you saw in the photographs, you saw the mountains, you saw the beaches. This is a country that could have, if it had peace and relative stability, which I'm not saying it doesn't have all the time. There are parts of Lebanon that have that. it's got a lot of things going for it. It's not a desolate place. It's a beautiful country with, I'm sure, some Lebanese, purely Lebanese media forms yet to be developed. Okay, so that leaves me now with wrapping up the video. And you remember, I hope, last time the video asked you a question that I did not answer. And that question was, of all the countries, when we were looking at media imports and exports, which country appeared to be the most like the United States? I asked you that question. I want to know now whether you answered that in your head at that time or whether you're just now thinking about it again for the second time. So answer in your head now if you haven't come up with an answer. And the answer has to be China, right? Isn't it amazing? Is it not amazing that we have a country that we're so critical of in terms of being a closed communist system that actually has many of the same attributes that we do in the United States when it comes to outside programs coming into the country? In China, you try to get on Facebook, no, it's blocked. The Chinese government's blocking it. But in the United States, you actually have programmers choosing not to offer it, choosing not to offer it out of patriotism, choosing not to offer it because that's not what the advertisers want, choosing not to offer it because the public hasn't yet been had that appetite stimulated for foreign content. We just don't even have that much, even Canadian, even that many Canadian. If we get Canadian people, they get hidden, like Shania Twain or Dan Aykroyd or Jim Carrey or Justin Bieber. They get buried in our culture. They're not Canadians anymore per se. We just don't have that much coming into the United States. So we are as isolated as China, but for we get there through very different courses of action when it comes to our media systems. And that, I think, in and of itself is one of the most important things that I can make sure that I end this video on and this course on, and looking just at these 8 countries. I hope you now have a great understanding of what you can look at and more when you look at a media system, and especially for those of you who get to travel, maybe even this summer, that you get to go there and you get to pick up a newspaper, and now you're looking for things that you never looked before because you took comparative media. That's my ultimate goal. Thanks a lot for a great class, and like I always say to you, good day.